Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know we have a full agenda to get into, but first just wanted to say hello, say welcome. Thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. This is the fourth installment of our ongoing webinar series on tariffs. We are glad to have you with us. Before we begin today, the Q&A is open throughout the session. I will address some of the questions that were submitted during the registration process. And if time allows, we will take some questions at the end as well. As with the previous sessions, however, all unanswered questions will be answered directly after the event. And before we dive in, just a brief but important disclaimer. The information that we're sharing today, it's not exhaustive. It's not considered legal advice. The trade landscape, as we all know, is highly fluid. The content presented is based on our best understanding of the information that is available as of today. CBP may issue clarifications or updates that could impact what we discuss here today. So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Kate Rayer. I serve as the Vice President of Regulatory Services at Green Worldwide. I'm actively involved in the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones, serving on several committees, including the Trade and Tariff Rapid Response Team. I also sit on the Trade Policy Committee with the World Trade Center Denver. Been doing this a while, 21 years in the industry now, 6 of those here with Green. I'm a licensed customs broker. I lead our global trade solutions products. We specialize in complex customs services, everything from managing foreign trade zones to duty drawback programs to strategic advisory services and enterprise level customs brokerage. Over the last few months, we've been helping our clients navigate these challenging and dynamic times. Many of the questions we hear is, I saw this on the news. What does it really mean? Is the news right? How do I separate fact from speculation? The goal today is to really help you cut through that noise, understand what's really happening, and most importantly, how it does impact your business and your supply chain. So today, what we're going to be covering is a pretty lengthy agenda. Just let me get situated real quick. Okay, we're going to be covering some key areas. We'll start with the current tariff landscape. I do want to talk about the tariff implementation sequence of events, the new US-UK trade framework, tariff unstacking, how to look up tariffs and resources, duty drawback, and foreign trade zones and bonded warehouses. I know, many of you are under a lot of pressure trying to plan amid the constant change. It's been incredibly demanding. And again, that makes me especially grateful that you are here with us today. One of the toughest questions that companies are facing is, how do I know which tariffs apply to my products? How do I calculate the new landed cost when things are shifting so quickly? How can you gather the right information to support your leadership in making fast, informed decisions and do so yourself? These are not easy questions, and that's precisely why we're here. I do aim to ease that burden a bit by walking you through the helpful resources, sharing some practical examples that do illustrate how these tariff scenarios are calculated. And finally, I want to emphasize, and I say this on every webinar, but more than ever, accurate HTS classification, country of origin determination and declaration, and the proper valuation are critical. These elements, they are the foundation of compliant customs entries and accurate tariff assessments. Okay, so getting into some of the more recent changes, there have been a significant number of trade policy updates over the last few weeks. Tariffs are dominating all of the headlines across every major news outlet. The pace of change has been rapid. Staying informed is more important than ever. So on this slide, I have outlined the key tariff developments, those that are already in effect and those that are still in the pipeline as of today. So starting at the top, the 20% tariff on China and Hong Kong under IEEPA. This was enacted back on March 4th. This is still in place. Canada and Mexico tariffs are currently at 25% unless the product does qualify for USMCA preference. There are specific rates for certain products, such as the 10% for potash and Canadian energy products. Steel and aluminum tariffs, these are under Section 232. These are now at 25%, and those went into effect on March 12th. Autos, which are also under 232, and auto parts as well, these are also at 25%, and they were enacted on April 3rd. The global reciprocal tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day, those did go into effect on April 5th. Along with that announcement came the country-specific reciprocal tariffs. Those were implemented very briefly on April 9th, and initially these did vary by country, but they were all reduced back to that baseline of 10%, except for China, which was increased to 125% and then rolled back to 10% as of today. Ongoing Section 232 investigations, these are covering different sectors such as copper, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, semiconductors, lumber, timber, and derivative products. And as of last week, there's been a new investigation initiated on commercial aircraft engines and parts. Effective dates for these are still to be determined. In general, these investigations do take a while, roughly around 270 days. So I do expect that we're going to see some news on these later this year. Under Section 301, there was an investigation for the China-built ships. This is right now slated to start in October. This is going to be starting at $50 per net ton. And for China-built ships owned by non-Chinese firms, these rates will start at $18 per net ton. Other proposed measures include harbor maintenance fee changes for Canada and Mexico, potential tariffs on Chinese port handling equipment, and also there's that IEEPA order that was for countries that are importing Venezuelan oil. We haven't seen much news on this. It is still kind of lingering out there. There have been no recent updates, but we are watching this one closely to see if anything does materialize there. So there also has been developments recently as to which tariffs stack, which tariffs do not. These rules are only for certain countries as of right now. So again, there are many places to check for proper tariff application, which I will go through. Okay, so first getting into the tariff implementation sequence of events. I want to talk about this because this is where you can track the changes of what's going on. This process generally follows a path through multiple different government sources, and understanding this can help you keep up to date with the changes and respond quickly. So this process starts with an executive order. This order typically outlines the legal authority being used, such as IEEPA or Section 232. It talks about the policy rationale, the products or sectors it affects, modification authority and implementation authority, reporting requirements, and general provisions. You can find all of the executive orders on the White House website. I did provide a link in here. Along through the whole presentation here, I have linked all of the different resources for you. The presentation will be provided after the fact, so that way you have an easy reference guide. And again, just always make sure you're looking for the most recent information, as this is incredibly fluid. Step 2 is the Federal Register. So once the executive order is signed, it's formally published into the Federal Register. This is where you'll find the binding language of the order, including effective dates and implementation details. From there, you see CBP takes over. They update ACE, they do the programming for the different harmonized tariff codes that may be changing. They also provide instructions via the CSMS messages. The CSMS messages generally are a little bit more detailed, and these are, you can subscribe to these. So if you go to Customs website, you look for the CSMS, there's a place to add your email address so you can subscribe to these updates. I do recommend doing so because they do provide, again, sometimes more context or additional information on all of these implementations. The last thing is, as far as the supplemental resources here, CBP has a FAQ that they update periodically. They have one specifically for IEEPA, they have one for the steel and aluminum tariffs, and they also have one for the autos and auto parts. They are receiving a ton of questions from the trade community about interpretation or clarification on these orders. They are taking those and putting in FAQs, which sometimes do provide additional context or clarification that has been kind of most frequently asked by the community. So again, these links are here. Highly recommend that you bookmark these and periodically check for updates there. Okay, so getting into the reciprocal tariff policy, this has gone through multiple revisions in the past several weeks. On the slide, you're going to see that I have, again, included the links to all of these. On Executive Order number 14257, this one originally rolled out the reciprocal tariff policy. This executive order includes the country-specific rates that were currently paused. It includes the exemptions. It includes special provisions for column 2 countries, which are the not most favored nation rates. Within Annex 1, you'll find the country-specific rates, which again, those have been paused. Annex 2 of this executive order further outlines the products that are exempt from these tariffs. So there's a long list of HTS codes that are exempt from the reciprocal tariffs that I highly recommend that you double check, cross-reference with your product database to make sure that if you do have products that are exempt, that you're realizing that exemption. Next came Executive Order 14259. This amended the policy. It did increase China's tariff rate, and it did update the de minimis thresholds for low value shipments from China. Following that was Executive Order 14266. This one also raised again the reciprocal rates. This is when they went up to 125%, and it also suspended the country-specific rates for other nations, reverting them back to the baseline of 10%. There was also an important clarification announced to Executive Order 14257. This one did add some HTS level exemptions, particularly for certain electronic parts. Most recently, a joint statement was released following the meeting that they had in Geneva this past weekend. This did update the China reciprocal rate to being at the 10% that it is now. That's effective as of today. What this does is aligns China's rate to the rates that are applied to other countries. It removes the additional tariffs that were placed by Executive Orders 14259 and 14266. And what it did is it took that rate back to the 34% that was originally announced, and then it gave a 90-day reduction down to 10%. Okay, so again, I know this is a lot. There's a lot of information here, but hopefully this helps kind of guide you on where to look for the most recent update and the changes. Understanding, which of the executive orders govern which part of the policy, what's currently active, what's not. This again is essential for determining tariff treatment and developing, different compliance strategies that you might want to look at. Also, the US and the UK announced a new trade framework. This was announced back on May 8th. This was the first announcement of any framework or agreement to come out of the reciprocal tariff negotiations. The US and the UK announced the framework, and the leaders, they outlined mutual commitments to improve market access, reduce trade barriers, and protect strategic industries. Under the framework, the US, they will maintain that 10% baseline tariff, and also they will have the 10% tariff on UK vehicles up to the 100,000 units annually. Volumes above that threshold will remain subject to the 25% tariff on Section 232. Negotiations are also underway for an alternative approach to the current Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. I imagine we're going to see more on that coming soon. And globally, as far as negotiations go, the administration is working on negotiating terms of new potential trade deals. We're continuing to monitor this, and we will share the information once available. But as of now, outside of the UK and the US, the temporary reduction on China, there have been no other deals reached as of now. Okay, so here we have Section 232 resources, which again, these tariffs relate to national security. So previously, Section 232 was only on steel and aluminum. Those were expanded in scope to include autos and auto parts. And many more commodities, like I mentioned, are currently under investigation under Section 232. Again, these investigations do take some time to complete, and I do expect that we will see an update on these later in the year. Regarding steel and aluminum and autos and auto parts, the same applies, and I have linked the relevant Federal Register notices here. Again, do recommend that you check out the relevant CSMS messages if you need more details. And also on here is a link to Green's reference guide, which is an easy way to kind of cross-reference which tariffs have the Section 232 for steel and aluminum on them and not. Again, just keep in mind you're always wanting to use the current publications. These might get updated in the future. So again, just always make sure that you're searching for the most updated information when you're looking. Okay, so I know there have been a lot of questions. I think the news has been covering this in different ways. So I do want to clarify what happened. with the US-China announcement that just came out. This announcement this week, it did lead to, I think, some relief, especially for the economy and importers, but it also has led to more questions. So this last weekend, the US and China reached a temporary trade framework during their negotiations in Geneva. This agreement is set to last for 90 days, so from May 14th through August of 2025, unless it is extended or altered, which of course, as we've all seen, that can happen. So here is what the US has committed to. A suspension of the proposed 34% tariff increase under Executive Order 14257. This is not a full rollback, and there is a 10% baseline that remains in place. This does, again, align it with the rates for all of the other countries. This is also a removal of the additional tariffs that were added under 14259 and 266. China, for its part, have also agreed to take reciprocal action by reducing or suspending duties on US goods imported into China. And what this symmetry does suggest is that, both sides are going to continue a dialogue. This could signal to potentially more stable phase in trade relations, at least in the short term. But again, only time will tell as this progresses. The other thing that did come out of this is there was a reduction on de minimis amounts. So the applicable duty on those went from 120% down to 54%. Keep in mind, as of right now, the understanding is once this 90-day pause is up, we will revert to the 34%, okay? And the 34% stacks on top of the other tariffs. So this would be your fentanyl rates, your Section 301 rates, all of those stack on top of each other, okay? So our understanding for now is that, again, it will go back to 34% unless something changes in the next 90 days, which is entirely possible. One other thing to note is that it does not appear, based on any of the information that has been released at this point, that there will be any refund process for goods imported over the last month or so. So until any further information is updated, as of now, there is not a process for going back to fix any of those entries. Okay, so I want to spend some time talking about all of the different things that need to be considered when it comes to different tariff applications. So the question everyone wants the answer to is, what is the final rate? What duty rate do I expect on my products? This answer, of course, is essential for businesses that are importing into the United States. And again, it's not always an easy answer. These are not in any particular order, except for that the bottom, those are the critical pieces of information that are needed to start the process. What you're always going to need to start the process is going to be your country of origin, your product's classification or harmonized tariff code, and the value of the product. If you don't have this information, you can't correctly determine the rates that will apply to your product. So once you have the origin, the HTS, and the value, you will be able to determine the general rate of duty. You do that by looking up the HTS code and the HTS book online. It'll tell you what the most favored nation rate is, and that is your general rate of duty. Once you have that, you can then check to see if there's any free trade agreements that may or may not be available to your imports. If they are available, you of course need to make sure that the merchandise does qualify. And just because it is made in a country, it does not mean that it meets the rules of origin required. Next, you have the date of entry. With all of this fluctuation in transit exemptions, use of foreign trade zones, use of bonded warehouses, in-bond movements, determining the correct date is essential to determining which rates will apply to your import. Next, you have the Chapter 98 provisions. There's a lot of provisions in this chapter available that can potentially mitigate tariffs. But again, only if the import does meet the conditions of the customs regulations for those. So an example would be, previously imported merchandise, temporary import bonds, returned U.S. products. There's a myriad of different provisions in there that can be reviewed and potentially utilized for certain types of imports. Next, the U.S. does have quotas in place for certain products. Sometimes these are based on how much have been imported in a given year. The rates may change for certain commodities throughout the year, depending on the volume being imported. Other things to review is if there are any anti-dumping, any countervailing duties that they may, those apply based on the products and the countries and potentially the manufacturer of the products. If there are, positive anti-dumping cases or countervailing cases, these rates also do need to be included in your total tariff landed cost. And then you have your trade remedy tariffs. So we have your IEEPA for fentanyl again, which again is currently in place for Canada, Mexico, and China. You have Section 301 on China. These are not new tariffs. So if you've been importing from China, you're likely familiar with these. You have Section 232 tariffs, Section 201 tariffs, and lastly, you have IEEPA reciprocal tariffs. All of these different trade measures, they do need to be considered to really understand the full impact. It's entirely possible that you are not impacted by some or even most of these. However, as an importer in the United States, it's important that you have an internal process to know, not only for compliance reasons, but for landed cost purposes, what does apply to your products. So I'm hoping that through today, I can help guide you on that. Okay, so created some process flows to explain how to unstack the stacking. We're using that phrase to understand which tariffs do and do not stack. Where to look for exemptions, and this flow explains the tariff implications for products, breaking down stacking of the additional tariffs under various trade measures. So the starting point, this process flow is for products of China. So first, the additional 20% applies to IEEPA, under IEEPA for all products of China unless exempt. Then you would review to see if you have any active Section 232 orders that apply to your products. If you do, so say you have a product subject to steel and aluminum, say you have a product subject to auto and auto parts, you would continue through the process flow, understanding that the tariffs are applied differently for steel and aluminum depending on the chapter. So again, this goes back to proper classification for your products. Is my classification in Chapter 73 or is it in 76 or is it outside those chapters? And if so, that will tell you how to get to the final cost. Okay. Now, if there are any Section 232 tariffs that apply, the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs doesn't. So if you follow the process flow, if you do have merchandise subject to 232, you are not also looking at the IEEPA reciprocal. Now, if you do not have the products that are subject to 232, you would follow towards the bottom of this process flow. So next, what you would do is see if they're exempt from the reciprocal tariffs for any reason. So this would be due to the Annex 2. So this goes back to reviewing the Federal Register notices, checking to make sure if your classification is listed on those. If it is, there's an exemption for the reciprocal tariffs. Other exemptions would be countries that are subject to non-most favored nation rates. Right now, that country list is fairly small, but if you do have imports from those countries, you're also exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. And as I mentioned, there was the release of additional exemptions for electronics. So all of these need to be checked to see if the reciprocal tariffs apply to your product. Okay, if they do, it's based on the country of origin of the product for which rate applies. And as of right now, that rate is 10% as a baseline for everybody. Again, this was the 125%, now down to 10 for China. Okay, so this chart is really trying to understand how potentially for China, how the different measures can layer on top of each other. And again, this is really to help answer how do I calculate the total duties for a product when multiple tariff regimes apply. So what you're seeing here is how additional tariffs under different trade actions for China specifically, Section 301, Section 232, the IEEPA fentanyl measures, and the new reciprocal tariffs. So I'm going to walk you through a few scenarios. These are ranked from lowest impact to highest impact. The blue text, these are conditional, meaning that they apply to certain products, and the green are static with some exemptions. So starting on row 1, you suppose your product is not impacted by Section 301 or Section 232, but it is subject to IEEPA fentanyl and the reciprocal tariff. In that case, you're looking at a 30%, 20% under IEEPA, 10% under reciprocal. Okay, keep in mind, this is in addition to all of your products' base duty rate, your general duty rate, any other applicable measures that we just went through, such as anti-dumping, countervailing, anything like that. So the second row, say you have a product that is subject to the 7.5% Section 301 tariff, but no Section 232 duties. Well, you would still add the IEEPA 20% and the reciprocal 10%, and then you're up to 37.5%. And again, plus your general duty rate. The third row, if your product isn't on the Section 301 list, but is subject to 232 at 25%, and that one also faces the IEEPA tariff. So that would be a total of 45% total add-on, again, before accounting for any general duty rates. On row 4, this combination, you have your 7.5% 301, your 25% Section 232, plus your IEEPA fentanyl of 20%, that brings you to 52.5. Row 5, you're looking at the full 25% under Section 301, plus the 20% IEEPA, the 10% reciprocal tariff, that one totals up to 55. And last, the maximum case here under these tariffs, these products are being hit by both the 25% Section 301 and the 25% Section 232, plus your IEEPA fentanyl tariff, and that brings your total to 70%. So again, understanding, which tariffs apply to which products becomes critical here, because you have, any range from 30 to 70%, which is, a pretty big difference when you're trying to understand your landed cost. So I do want to share just a how to look up which Section 301 applies to your products in just a moment, and also share the resources with you here. So Section 301, there is a fairly simple way to look up if Section 301 applies to your product. You're just going to want to look at the HTS book. Subject HTS numbers, they will have a footnote associated, which will guide you to the Chapter 99 code that would tell you which Section 301 rate applies to your product. And also provided here is the Federal Register notice for the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs. Again, do check out the CSMS messages. These are helpful for understanding any of the more nuance to these tariffs and their implementation. Okay, so how do you look this up? Here's an example of where the footnote is. So this is an example of footwear, so HTS number 6404, 1939. If you see next to the general rate of duty there, you see there's a little tiny number 5. So that is the footnote that you would want to refer to understand which additional tariffs may need to be considered. So on the bottom left here shows you which footnote. So we're looking at number 5 again. So I highlighted that on the bottom. So that one tells you need to go look at 9903, 2709, and 9903, 8815. So on the top right, you can see 9903, 2709. That one has a yellow highlight on it. So the yellow highlight tells you that that is expired. Okay, so you don't need to consider that one. However, the second one, the 9903, 8815, you can see in the rate of duty on the right side there, the duty provided in the applicable subheading plus 7.5%. So that tells you, if we go back up to looking at this chart here, you would find yourself in the 7.5% category. And from there, you would then need to determine if Section 232 applies to your product to get to your total landed, total additional cost. Okay. All right, so moving on to talk more about what's going on with Canada and Mexico. So just like with Section 232 and other IEEPA tariffs, with these you would still refer to your executive orders, the Federal Register notices, and CSMS messages for additional details. As far as the exemptions go, these are all detailed in these publications. One of the exemptions to the Canada-Mexico fentanyl tariffs is for products that do qualify for USMCA preference. I have included information about this as a reference. I do want to caution, if you are planning to claim an exemption to tariffs due to the product qualifying for USMCA, do your homework, make sure that the due diligence is done to make sure that the product does qualify under USMCA and you do have the documentation to prove it. A lot of companies that previously did not qualify products for USMCA due to general rates of duty being free or maybe low, maybe it wasn't worth, the effort of going down that path. A lot of companies are now, obviously with, the exemption to these tariffs, working to qualify their products. Again, make sure it's done correctly. Expect scrutiny on these, expect proof requests, and you definitely need to be ready to provide them when asked. I will tell you that I have seen a large uptick in the USMCA claimed preference just in general entry summary data. So it has become obviously a much more important topic, and make sure again that the claim can be documented and backed up. Okay, so unstacking the stacking for Canada and Mexico. I do want to focus on this because this is a recent change. This was announced back on April 29th, and what this did is it updated which tariffs do and do not stack for Canada and Mexico. CBP indicated that if there were entries that were filed before this announcement was made, that there will be an opportunity to go back and file retroactive corrections for these. So if you do have entries that are affected by this and the tariff stacking was applied incorrectly, you'll want to make sure that those entries are corrected and filed with customs. So starting at the top, as a reminder, IEEPA tariffs do not currently apply to products of Canada or Mexico. This may change if and when the emergency at the border is terminated. So if that happens, I would expect that we'll see reciprocal tariffs apply instead. So the first step here is to check to see if your product is subject to Section 232 under auto and auto parts. If it is, then you need to determine if the product qualifies for USMCA preference. And if it does, you'll want to have, you'll have no additional tariff under Section 232 for auto parts or IEEPA reciprocal for autos. The 25% would be based on non-US content. If products are subject to 232 auto, but do not qualify under USMCA, then the 25% applies. Again, there was some new information released regarding potential offsets for these. So if you do have products that are subject to the auto and auto parts that you are importing from Canada and Mexico, definitely recommend that you go take a look at the executive orders to really understand what that offset is going to look like. For products that are not subject to Section 232, you would confirm again if USMCA preference is applicable. If it is, no IEEPA tariffs apply, but then you would also check to see if your product is subject to 232 for steel or aluminum. And if yes, again, based on the material classification, is it in Chapter 73 or 76 or not, the tariff will then be based on the total value of the steel or aluminum in the product. So this one got a little bit more complicated, obviously with the change that came out on April 29th. This actually, I think, is a positive, right, that these tariffs are not stacking for Canada and Mexico. However, it is making it more challenging to make sure that the correct tariff application happens. So again, I recommend if you do have entries that are subject to this, that you take a good look through them and make sure that if our corrections are needed, that those are filed. Okay, so for other countries, it's a little bit more straightforward. The process does follow the same logical steps. You again need to review if the product is subject to 232 orders. If so, these are exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. If there is no Section 232, you would review if the product qualifies for any exemptions to the reciprocal tariffs. Again, these are products listed in Annex 2, countries subject to non-MFN rates, electronics, etc. So if there is an exemption, then no reciprocal tariffs apply. And if not, then the reciprocal tariffs apply based on the rates in effect at the time of entry. Okay, so keep an eye on what's going to be happening, of course, in the next 60 to 90 days with different countries releasing different rates. We might see some changes right now, but right now we're currently at the 10% for everybody. So here are some examples. I have two of them. So what this one is for, it's for the same product, 100% steel springs for bed mattresses classified in Chapter 73. If these are made in China, they would be subject to Section 301 at 25%, 20% for IEEPA fentanyl, 25% for Section 232. So again, what that 232 does is it exempts you from the reciprocal tariff. So you don't have both. They would also then have your 2.9% general duty rate. So the total for the China imports of this product would be 72.9%. Now, if you're looking at the same product that is made in Vietnam, this one is subject to 232 again. It is again not subject to reciprocal because it's subject to 232. And then you also have the 2.9% general rate. So that brings the total to 27.9%. And then you have the same product again from Mexico. The one on the very right is for products not subject to or not qualifying for USMCA. And the one on the bottom is one that is subject to USMCA. So the one for non-USMCA, you have your 25% IEEPA fentanyl, and you have your 2.9% general duty rate and 0% reciprocal. That would be 27.9%. And made in Mexico with USMCA preference gets down to 0%. So again, the same product, different sources leads to incredibly different costs for tariffs. Second example is for cotton bed pillows. So these are classified in Chapter 94. Again, same countries for the example. We've got China, Vietnam, and Mexico. If they're made in China, they would be subject to 301 at 7.5%, 20% for IEEPA fentanyl, 5.3% for the general duty rate, and 10% reciprocal. So you see for this one, because there's no Section 232 tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs do apply. So the tariffs for these for China is 32.8. For Vietnam, you don't have your 301 because those apply to China. You don't have your IEEPA fentanyl because again, those are for China only. For this one, you only have the 5.3% duty rate and the 10% reciprocal. So the total for Vietnam is 15.3. Made in Mexico, non-USMCA, so 25% IEEPA fentanyl, 5.3% general duty rate, and 0% reciprocal for 30.3. And the same example for Mexico with USMCA preference is down to 0. So just want to cover duty drawback. We've been getting a lot of requests for drawback recently. This is because under the new tariffs, most of them are not eligible for drawback. However, the reciprocal tariffs are. So what duty drawback is it's the program that allows for claimants, so a drawback claimant, to file for refunds of duties, tariffs, and taxes paid to customs when merchandise is exported or destroyed. So currently, again, both the Section 301 tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs are allowed for drawback. This is a big win because with the rest of the tariffs, including IEEPA fentanyl and Section 232, those are not eligible for drawback. So you can still file drawback on entries where only certain tariffs are allowed for drawback. However, you would only receive a refund where drawback is allowed, the tariff is on the okay list, and the general rate of duty would also be claimable. With this news, again, we've been seeing a lot more interest in this program. Maybe it previously wasn't interesting enough or worth the time to go get refunds. However, because of this news with the reciprocal tariffs being eligible for drawback, more companies are reconsidering looking into drawback. Any company can explore drawback as an option for mitigating certain tariffs. However, the exporter from the United States is the first party that is eligible. So if you are both an importer and an exporter, the process is much simpler. If you're only the exporter, you would need to get cooperation with the initial importer to explore drawback because you will need to have import records. If you are the importer but not the exporter, same thing, only in reverse. You would need to make sure you have cooperation with the exporter. They would need to provide you with export records. This program can be very beneficial to a lot of companies, but it is an investment in time and labor. If you do have imports and you do have exports or destructions and you have records, you have data that you could provide for claims, it's definitely worth exploring to see what potential refunds could be available. Important to note as well, there is drawback privileges that can allow you to potentially go back 5 years. So again, this is a requirement that you have. All right, hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I heard we're having some audio issues. Okay, so getting into talking more about FTZs and bonded warehouses. This came up a lot in the pre-registration process. This has been coming up a lot with different companies looking for, options, looking for potential short-term storage to potentially write out tariffs or defer cash flow. We've been seeing a large increase in demand, but it is important to consider the nuances and considerations for each. So on this chart, I have kind of done a foreign trade zone versus bonded warehouse so you can really understand the differences here. So for foreign trade zones, goods can be stored indefinitely. This is a great option for long-term storage. For bonded warehouses, goods can be stored for up to 5 years, which, again, works well for most long-term situations, but there is a time limit on those. As far as setup goes, if you're looking to utilize a 3PL foreign trade zone, you do need to be registered with that zone operator, as a 3PL needs to get you set up properly. Due to the higher compliance requirements, Ftzs, can be better suited for larger operations with more data availability that help with the inventory tracking. Bonded warehouse setups are a little bit more straightforward. Customs brokers will file warehouse entries and withdrawals, generally coordinating with a Class 3 bonded facility. This is a little bit of a faster setup process. It does make it ideal for businesses looking for a more quick solution, more temporary solution. Ftzs do allow for more liberal activities, so businesses can engage in sorting, destruction, labeling, assembly, manufacturing. It does make Ftzs a great option for businesses needing flexibility in how they handle inventory, where bonded warehouses are more limited, so activities are generally restricted to cleaning, repackaging, labeling, sorting, but you do have to get CBP approval for those operations. As far as entering commerce from foreign trade zones or for exports, generally out of Ftzs, you can utilize a weekly entry process. This is subject to approval. Some commodities are a little bit more challenging to get approval for than others. Goods can also be exported in bond, and what that means is if you have goods go into a foreign trade zone and you want them to exit U.S. commerce, you can file an in bond out, and you won't pay the tariffs as the merchandise does not enter U.S. commerce. For bonded warehouses, just like with Ftzs, they enter commerce upon withdrawal, and you can also export in bond from a bonded warehouse as well. So foreign trade zones, the new tariffs, they have required admission and privileged foreign status for most commodities. And what that means is that the duty and tariff rates are fixed at the time of admission and cannot be changed. With bonded warehouses, duty rates are based on the time of entry into U.S. commerce. This has been a question I have been getting a lot as to when the tariff application happens and what rates are used. So again, for foreign trade zones, if it requires privileged foreign status, which most tariffs do, it's set at the time of admission. For bonded warehouses, it's set at the time it enters U.S. commerce. So again, it's kind of a gamble of, which option makes the most sense. Do I want to lock in the tariff rates as of today? Do I want to hold the merchandise and wait for tariffs to go down? Do I expect the tariffs to go up? So understanding that nuance of when the tariffs apply is very important when you're going down this path of understanding which one makes the most sense for your business. For foreign trade zones, both foreign and domestic merchandise are allowed. For bonded warehouses, only foreign merchandise is permitted. This does make it more restrictive than foreign trade zones. It's important to note as well that goods that are entered into a bonded warehouse cannot be admitted into a foreign trade zone unless they're admitted in zone restricted status. And what this means is that it requires export or destruction. You cannot then enter them into U.S. commerce. So keep in mind, if you're trying to kind of look at both solutions as an option with a particular product, you can't submit an entry to a bonded warehouse and then transfer it to a foreign trade zone unless you have an intent to export that product. On the reverse, privileged foreign status goods that enter foreign trade zones cannot move to a bonded warehouse. Non-privileged can move, but again, only for the remainder of the 5 years. Additionally, just on de minimis, foreign trade zones do not permit de minimis entries for small shipments. So if you were exploring the option of potentially putting, small packages into a foreign trade zones and then doing de minimis entries out, that is not currently permissible. Okay, so this chart is really just a summary of this. Again, the point of all of this is to make the right choice. Both programs can be beneficial, really depending on the objectives. They should be carefully evaluated because, again, they do have different implications based on the date of entry. If you are looking to defer customs duties or tariffs and expect that tariffs may increase, it may make sense to look at the foreign trade zone program. If you're looking to defer duty and tariffs and expect tariffs to decrease, evaluating the bonded warehouse solution may make sense as well. Again, there are other trade programs out there that may be beneficial to explore, such as temporary import bonds, duty drawbacks. So as you're really kind of diving into mitigation options that are out there, it's just very important that you kind of dig into the nuance of all of them to make sure that you're going into the decision with all of the information. So just want to quickly cover some trade statistics as I think these are really interesting. So CBP publishes their trade statistics, and they just recently published these for Q1 of this year. So this is through the end of March. What this really indicates here is that we're seeing a sharp increase in enforcement with CBP. So on the top chart, you can see that increase in the net revenue recovered due to entry summary reviews. So in 2024, for the entire year, this number was 667 million. And so far in fiscal year 2025, just again through Q1, it's already 20 billion. This is a pretty strong indicator that enforcement is high. And just a reminder, to make sure that your customs compliance house is in order, make sure you understand that your classifications are correct, you're utilizing trade programs correctly, your origin is correct, your value is correct. Because again, this is a very strong indicator that CBP is paying attention. On the bottom chart, you can see the total duty and tax that has already been collected this year. So this is already at 57 billion just through Q1. As compared to all of 2024, this was 88 billion. And also, I find it interesting that you can look at, the different tariffs, the different trade remedies that have come out and kind of what those impacts have been. I really think the new tariffs are kind of staggering as to how much we have collected here. We've already collected in Q1 of 2025 almost as much as we collected in all of 2024. Also keep in mind with this is not realizing the full impact of all of these tariffs since this data is only through the end of March. So I do obviously expect that these numbers are going to continue to increase here, but you can see that the numbers are telling the story of how impactful this has been to the trade community. Talking about what is the impact that we've been seeing, before the tariff decrease was announced, we had been seeing a lot of canceled bookings, blank sailings. We're seeing that now shift to pressure on capacity, reduced blank sailings. Companies that maybe were holding purchase orders are now pushing to get merchandise in and front-loading inventory during this pause. Companies are still exploring potential changes in sourcing while others are leaning into more existing supplier relationships. Companies are considering using temporary import bonds, and maybe now they're kind of changing that strategy and looking at standard customs clearance in this time frame. There's been a lot of questions of, how do I pass tariffs along to consumers? Do I do that? And now the reverse is being considered. Do I pause on that? What is the approach? The stock market did take a beating. We're seeing that rebound now due to this news. Regardless of tariffs, companies are now scrutinizing their customs value to make sure it's correct, that all charges that have been, that can be compliantly removed from the value are considered. Companies that may be considering using bonded warehouses, they might be reversing that strategy and looking at foreign trade zones in this interim. We're still seeing a lot of companies putting effort into making sure HTS reviews are accurate, making sure that tariff engineering opportunities are explored. Making sure that the tariffs are optimized, they've got a solid list, they know how to make sure that the changes are ultimately analyzed quickly so you have a new landed cost when this stuff shifts around. And ultimately what we're seeing is a lot of companies are spending a lot of time and resources to make sure that these databases are right and nimble. Because obviously with these changes, you can start to see how quickly you need to be able to analyze these things to be able to forecast future tariff impacts. So, as much as we were seeing in the market last week and the week before, as far as, reduced capacity into the U.S., we're now seeing that flip around while companies are trying to get merchandise in. So going to be interesting. I think we're going to see some disruption. So again, if you do have a lot of inventory you're trying to get in, prioritize, make sure you're getting those bookings in, because I think we will start to see some pressure on capacity. So questions from the audience. I did pick out a few that were kind of the heavy hitters in here. So first being, does the President's extension of reciprocal tariffs by 90 days to July 9th refer to the U.S. port or a departure from the country of origin? And the answer to this is, tariffs are generally based on the date of entry. In the past announcements, there has been some in-transit exemptions and tariffs. So we're going to have to wait for official guidance to know how this will be handled. But if it does follow precedents, we may or may not see those in-transit exemptions apply. How to correctly look up HTS codes and if tariffs apply to them. So as I've mentioned before, the first step, again, is to make sure you have the correct product classification. The country of origin will also be critical to let you know which tariffs apply based on those. You need to look at free trade agreements. You need to look at Section 301 if you have products from China. You need to review Section 232 to see if you have products that apply there. So following the hierarchy of everything you need to look at will tell you which tariffs will apply to your products. How to keep track of tariff movements, to be on the front foot and not the back foot. Again, recommend that you are, if you're not already signed up for Green's weekly market update, subscribe to CSMS messages from CBP, follow the executive orders, follow the news. Just caution with the news, sometimes they haven't got it quite right. There's also great publications from trade to consider. There's trade associations, both local and national, that are constantly putting out information. So there's a lot of sources out there, again, but just to make sure you're in tune, subscribe to Green's weekly market update. We're constantly publishing this information out and follow all of the steps that I mentioned before, such as the CSMS and executive orders. Can you confirm that when we release containers from the bonded warehousing that we will only pay the tariff rate at that exact date? So as mentioned, the entry date out of the bonded warehouse sets the rates of tariffs and duty. Okay, so the reverse for foreign trade zones, where it's the time of admission, for bonded warehouses, it's the time of entry into U.S. commerce. Is tariff inversion still valid for foreign trade zones? Again, most products do require privileged foreign status admission. If that's the case, you cannot invert those. Okay, so you'll want to make sure that you understand if your commodity does require privileged foreign admission, and that will help you understand which ones can and can't be inverted. Can I ship product from China to the US, put it in a bonded warehouse, and wait for tariffs to come down? Yes. Also be aware that if the rates do increase, you'll be stuck with the higher rates. So it all depends again on when they're entered, so do so with caution. We send parts to US for repair. Would a temporary import bond avoid the charges for steel, aluminum, and iron on Section 232? Potentially, yes. So you can use a temporary import bond. I do recommend that you fully understand the requirements for these. You do have to have solid management for this, because you do have to make sure that the products that you import on a temporary import bond are exported and that the temporary import bond is closed out within the required time frame. So it does require careful management, because there is a default if you do not do this, and you will be responsible for double the duties and taxes. If tariff rates decline, is there a course of action to obtain reimbursement for duties already paid? What if shipped but not yet received? So again, this has been really dependent on what the changes have been. So if the tariff rates do decline, such as the example we're dealing with right now, where the China rates were at 125 and now they're down to 10. At this time, there is not a process for going back to correct those entries. If CBP does come out and say there's a process, then of course pursue that. But as of now, there is no information related to a reimbursement. The one thing that they did say is that if you did have incorrect tariff stacking application for Canada and for Mexico, there is a process for going back to fix those. So it really just depends on which tariffs you're reviewing on whether or not that is possible. If tariffs with China lower, would we be able to enter items in FTZ with the new lower rate? So again, the rates for tariffs for foreign trade zones, if they require privileged foreign status admission, which most do, the rates are locked at the date of admission. Okay, so if the rates go lower, you're stuck with the higher rate. So again, just reversal, right? Both programs are handled in different ways. So with foreign trade zones, they're set at the time of admission. With bonded warehouses, they're set at the time of entry. How to make sure we are in compliance. I love this question. It's a great one. So with so many changes, so much nuance, this one is a real challenge. As an importer, you need to be familiar and knowledgeable regarding tariffs, valuation, proper country of origin declaration, making sure your customs entries are correct. Now, if they're not already, it's the time to get your hands dirty. Make sure you're getting your entry summaries from your brokers. Make sure that you are getting data from your brokers. Make sure that you are auditing it. Make sure that you have access to ACE if you don't already, and monitor and audit. Remember, you as the importer are responsible for exercising reasonable care. So if you need help, consult with trade advisors, customs brokers, trade attorneys. As mentioned before, CBP has increased enforcement, so you want to make sure you're paying attention. How closely are CBP watching for HTS code changes? So the answer to this question is very similar to the last question. CBP has increased enforcement. They have more data than they ever have, right, with ACE. Proper classification is critical. If you do have an incorrect classification that has been used historically and you need to change it to a correct one, there are mechanisms to do that. Okay, and if the reverse is true, there are mechanisms to do that, but you have to do it in the proper way. What we don't recommend is, obviously changing HTS code for a more favorable rate, cannot do that. But if there is a legitimate reason for an HTS change, definitely make sure you talk to your customs broker about how to approach that situation. All right. I saw a lot of questions flying in the chat. I don't think I'm going to get time to them today. We had a lot to cover, but as with before, we will go through them and answer them directly. So please expect a response from us if you did submit a question. And other than that, I really want to thank you for spending time with us today. I know this was a lot to cover. Hopefully provides you with some resources to kind of help guide through this process. If you need help, contact us. We're happy to support. We will be sending out the presentation afterwards, so you'll have all the reference guides and links and everything in there. So again, thank you and have a great rest of your day.